All right, so we are jumping right into Genesis chapter 47. And we're going deep with some help from our friends over at My Christian Space, right? Famine, purpose, blessings. Phew. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is interesting because you're thrown right into this crisis, right? It's not like, oh, this is going to happen. Boom, famine, right in your face.
Mm-hmm.
Egypt, Canaan, nobody's got anything going on. Well, I mean, they're desperate, right?
Resources. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So seeing how different characters are reacting, we're talking Yosef, we're talking his family to that kind of pressure. I mean, how do you even deal with that, right?
And that's where this whole idea of just surviving versus like really living with a purpose. Like how often when things are tough, you just like got to get through the day. But then this makes you stop and think like, what does it mean to actually live when you're in that crisis?
Absolutely.
Still relevant today, don't you think?
Totally. And I think the commentary uses a great example right off the bat with Yosef's brothers, right? They come before Pharaoh, and the first thing they do is acknowledge their need. They approach him with humility, right? It's not about, oh, we deserve this or you owe us this. It's we're dependent on somebody more powerful than us in this moment.
And that's the whole parallel with approaching God.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the commentary even digs into like the Hebrew word for Goshen. That's the place where they're asking to live. And it's rooted in this idea of approaching, right? So it's not just about like where they are geographically, it's how they're approaching, first Pharaoh, but ultimately God. And it suggests that like that posture matters, right?
It's not about like what we think we deserve,
Yes.
It's more about recognizing what we need.
Totally.
And recognizing that need. Okay, that's a good word. I like that. And then you've got Yaakov, who's 130 years old at this point, and he's describing his life as like few and difficult. And the commentary is really pointing to the fact that like he sees those years as kind of evil because they weren't lived according to God's will for his life.
Can you imagine getting to 130 and being like, man, yeah, it wasn't enough.
Yeah, what was he doing all those years? Like, what
right.
was he really messing up that belly? Okay, we got to unpack that. I'm very curious. But speaking of unpacking things, can we talk about these blessings that are like popping up out of nowhere?
Yeah. Well, this is where I think Yosef's leadership takes center stage because, he's not just trying to survive the famine, he's trying to overcome it, right?
Yeah.
And, in doing so, he becomes this vessel for blessing, but not just for his own people. I mean, even the Egyptians who don't share his faith are touched by this. And the commentary refers to it as a collateral blessing, which I think is kind of a...
Interesting way to put it.
It is an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, like a ripple effect. That what we do, can actually have positive impact on the world around us, even if they don't, see the world exactly the same way we do.
Absolutely.
Okay, but let's get into the nuts and bolts of how Yosef actually handles this whole crisis, right?
Yeah.
Because he's not just handing out free food indefinitely.
Right. There's a system here, and this is where I think things get really, really interesting. He basically makes the Egyptians sell their land to Pharaoh in exchange for food. Now, the only exception to this are the priests, because they were already supported by Pharaoh.
Yeah, so essentially this famine completely reshapes the power structure of Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Where like Pharaoh ends up owning all the land and everyone else is like a tenant farmer.
It's a power play, isn't it? I mean, you think about it, Pharaoh's consolidating power, strengthening his own position, but at the same time, you've got Yosef making sure everybody at least has something to eat.
And we learn that there's this whole system where Pharaoh gets 20% and then the rest goes back to the people, both for food and to plant for the future.
Yeah.
I mean, that's some like next level strategic thinking right there. It's not just about the immediate need, it's about sustainability. It's about planning long term.
Absolutely. And that, to me, that really highlights how true leadership, it goes beyond just putting out fires, right? Like you're saying, it's that foresight, that strategic planning, that deep, genuine concern for the well-being of everyone involved for the long haul. I mean,
it's amazing. And it's fascinating, too, because you see how, like, the Israelites are flourishing under Yosef's leadership. They're, multiplying, they're prospering. But then on the other side, you've got the Egyptians who are, forced to surrender their land just to survive.
Yeah, it really makes you think about that concept of, God's blessing on his people, even when times are tough. But then it also, it brings up all these interesting questions, right? About, the ethics of wielding that kind of power, especially during a crisis.
It's messy, right? There's no easy answers.
No easy answer.
It's almost like the famine creates this whole new social order.
Yeah, and it makes you really kind of wrestle with that balance between survival and freedom. You know what I mean? It is a balancing act, isn't it? And it's a question that, like, you know, it echoes through history, right? This idea of what we're willing to give up to feel safe and secure. But speaking of things that echo through time, this chapter ends with this really powerful moment that, like, foreshadows what's to come.
Oh, you're talking about Yakov, right? He's like on his deathbed.
Yeah.
And he makes Yosef promise to bury him back in, their homeland, not in Egypt.
Yeah.
Seems kind of simple, but...
And it's huge, right? Because it's this, like, seemingly insignificant detail, but it's actually pointing to the future Exodus, the Israelites eventually returning to their homeland. It's that reminder, like, don't forget your history, don't forget where you came from, even if you're in a good place right now.
It's like Yaakov saying, look, we're in Egypt now, but this isn't, home. That feeling, though, right? That connection to your roots, that's powerful stuff. Especially when you think about it, they are surrounded by this completely different culture.
Totally. And it underscores that whole idea of living with purpose, right? I mean, think about it. Yosef, he's thriving in Egypt, right? Yeah. But he never loses sight of who he is or where he comes from. It's a good reminder that we can find success in the world without, like, compromising those things that make us, our values, our identity.
Easier said than done, though, right?
It is. It is.
To find that balance. Phew.
Yeah.
Not easy. But it does lead us back to that bigger question that the commentary leaves us with. Mm-hmm. How do we live in a way that blesses others, without losing sight of our own identity, our own heritage?
$1 million question, right. And I think people have been wrestling with that for centuries, Like, there's no easy answer to that. There's no, like, oh, here's the 3 steps and you've got to figure it out, right? But by going through this story with Yosef and his family, and what they went through in Egypt, we can at least begin to, like, unpack some of those complexities, right?
Yeah.
Faith, of purpose, even just, cultural identity.
And the wild part is, it's like these insights, they're just as relevant today, Yeah. Like, we might not be facing a literal famine, but we all have those moments, those challenges where, you kind of get squeezed, right?
Yeah.
And it forces you to really figure out, okay, what do I believe? What actually matters to me?
It's like looking in a mirror, but the reflection is from thousands of years ago.
Right. It's trippy. It's kind of wild when you think about it, how a story from, like, thousands of years ago can still hit so close to home, Yeah. I mean, we might not be dealing with a famine literally, but we all have those moments.
Oh, yeah.
Those challenges that really, like, put you to the test. You got to kind of look in the mirror and go, okay, who am I really?
For sure. I think that's the beauty of these stories, right? Like, as ancient as they are, they still hold these, like, timeless truths, They transcend, like, our culture, they transcend time.
That's true.
And they force us, or they invite us, I should say, to ask those same questions that, folks have been asking for millennia. Like, what's my purpose? Who am I? How do I make sense of this crazy world?
Right. It's like, how much has really changed? So as we kind of, like, wrap up our deep dive into Genesis 47 here, what's the, like, if you had to pick one thing, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, even when everything around you feels shaky, right? Like unstable, like the rug's about to be pulled out, you can still choose to live with purpose. Like, that's huge.
It is huge.
Yosef's story, I think, really reminds us that we can go through really difficult things and not just survive them, but thrive in the middle of them and be a force for good while we're at it.
Right.
And we can do all that while, like, remaining true to who we are, even when we're a million miles from where we thought we'd be.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful message, I think. Hope, resilience.
Yeah.
And it's a good reminder, too, that, like, the choices that we make, they all matter.
Right.
Whether we think they're big or small, there's, like, a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. It shapes our lives, but it also impacts the people around us.
Absolutely, yeah. So the next time you're facing a challenge, right, remember Yosef. Remember that even in famine, even when it seems like there's not enough to go around, there's still room for blessing. There's still room for growth. There's still room for a life that, like, really reflects who you are, deep down.
At your core, yeah. Thanks for diving deep with me today.
Always a pleasure.
And to all of you listening, keep digging into those ancient stories. You never know what might be waiting for you. Until next time, we'll see you on the next deep dive.